All right, so I'm really excited to be here this year. I was here last year too. I'm going to try to give you not the exact same talk. But what I want to talk about is, this idea of computers being easy and people being hard. And you're thinking, wait a minute, that's a vast oversimplification. And you're right. I mean, that is true, right? So we'll talk about it. So yeah, I'm Bridget Kromhout. For those of you who don't know me, I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is basically honorary Canada. Please annex us. I podcast with Arrested DevOps, and I am the chief cook and bottle washer in the Global DevOps Days organization. For those of you who aren't aware, it doesn't only happen in Toronto, which is of course a fantastic place for it to happen, but we were in 42 cities on 6 continents in 2016. So for those of you who aren't from Toronto and maybe had to travel to get here, you should talk to me later about having one in your city. And you can find me later at the Pivotal table, because we're sponsoring, because we believe in this stuff. And I work for Pivotal doing tech advocacy for Cloud Foundry. I was a team ops life for about 15 years, and as it turns out, when you trade being on call for being on a plane, you still don't sleep very much. I was at a conference in Portland yesterday, so. Yeah, but let's talk about the great lie that is the title of this presentation. I would say, obviously the complex systems that we're building are more nuanced and interconnected and have many points of failure than ever before. But at the same time, the interconnections between our humans are part of this system, and we spend an awful lot of time talking about exactly which kind of containerized microservices, orchestrator that we're going to use, and we don't necessarily spend as much time figuring out why that other team doesn't want to use it. It's well, a lot of times when you roll something out and the impediment to actually getting, whatever shiny that you want to use in place is that you can't seem to get that other team to just understand that you're right. So we'll talk about, how we can do that. Let's talk really quick about the pace of change. I would just love just shout it out, quick brainstorming session here. When do you think this phrase was from? And if you can't read it in the back, it says, in the last week, there were 67 deploys of 496 changes by 18 people. When does that sound like it might have happened? I hear 2010, perhaps. I'm that's actually a decent guess. It's not right. That's from the Flickr dev blog from 2008. And you're like, seriously? And those of us who are sitting there thinking, yeah, my company can't do that today. Am I just so far behind the curve? What am I going to do now? Well, the good news is the dev and ops cooperation, that was happening at that point is the sort of thing that is all of us can do this now. It was very much, just for unicorns at that point, and it's a lot more feasible for everyone to start moving a lot faster now. And that doesn't mean that there are magical tools now. There obviously are more advanced tools now than there were in 2008, but it's a lot easier now than it was then, except for the part that all those pesky humans still keep getting in the way. What do we do about that? Okay, so I think one of the things, I'm just gonna come clean and tell you that yes, I ran Docker in production back when the main thing on Docker's website was under no circumstances should you run this in production. And it's I joined a company that started running it in production in 2013, and I joined in 2014 because I was these people aren't afraid of things. This is fun. But if you're letting everyone at your organization build everything that they want to because it's fun, you may or may not be getting to your actual goals, unless your actual goals are building whatever that thing is. So that's the caution that I would put out there is when every time somebody wants to add a new technology to your stack, or they want to switch platforms, or they want to add multiple IaaSes for reasons, every time somebody wants to do something like that, think to yourself and then ask them, how does this help us get to our goals? I mean, if the goal is, I just really want to write a custom message bus in Erlang, and I want to get that out to production. It's okay, be honest about it if that's the goal. But I feel when we're deciding how to get to the goal, especially in large enterprises, which I know a lot of you are at large enterprises, there's often all sorts of different initiatives. So there might be the continuous delivery initiative, and there might be the DevOps initiative, maybe with a DevOps team somewhere, and there might be the people who are in charge of your cloud strategy. They may or may not, and maybe there's some microservices people, and they may or may not be talking to each other. And this is back to the people are hard. Like, if everybody is, thinking about what their project and what their team is working on, it's sometimes hard to come together for the, general good of the organization if it is not reflected in your incentives. So we'll talk about that. But that's, when we talk about this DevOps thing, it's not one of these things, right? It's this collaboration. The DevOps Days conferences, and I know a lot of you this is your first time at a DevOps Days, it started from a discussion that Patrick Dubois and my boss at Pivotal, actually, Andrew Clay Schaefer, had in 2008 about applying the principles of Agile to systems administration, just so that we wouldn't be quite so stodgy as we were. Some of us who have been sysadmins since the 90s are possibly more stodgy than others. But this idea of applying those principles to our infrastructure, making our infrastructure more agile and more responsive to our organization's needs. That discussion turned into a conversation, that conversation, which was at the Agile conference. Andrew Clay Schaefer proposed it as an open space, because they had open space, like birds of a feather type sessions. And then he thought, nobody's going to want to talk about this. So he didn't go to his own open space. And Patrick Dubois is the only person who did. Couldn't find Andrew and was like, what? Went and found him later, talked to him, and they got what it turned into this. So that's kind of for this afternoon, don't just go back to your office or, pull out your laptop. Like, that's the part where you actually get to discuss with others. But let's talk about, the kinds of complex ecosystems that we're building. This, by the way, is my spouse Joe canoeing up in the boundary waters between, Minnesota and Canada. And I feel like the ecosystems that we're building are complex to the point of being hard for single people to understand, which is why, of course, we start decomposing everything into microservices, which, obviously you move your complexity to, from IPC to network communications. Like, you've just moved your complexity around, you still have it. And that's kind of you probably do have to decompose giant monoliths at some point just to make them manageable, but that doesn't mean that, there is no complexity, or complexity doesn't exist anymore. So a lot of organizations are trying to figure out, how they're going to deliver software, while understanding the complexity that's out there. But I think another thing a lot of organizations that I talk to, now that I work at a vendor and go in and talk to organizations, is a lot of organizations are worried about disruptors in their field. Whether they're worried about fintech startups, if they're in finance or whatever. The idea that, if you're an old school auto manufacturer and there's Tesla doing who knows what, there's this idea that well, how do we catch up? Or how do we prevent having somebody else eat our lunch? And I think a lot of the companies that have been around for a really long time have been reinventing themselves. I mean, we've got some sponsors here where you're a bank. Why are you here at DevOps Days? Well, I mean, there's a reason. They're reinventing themselves. They're bringing in really great people. And I think this is from Settlers of Catan, and the disruption that happens in this game is happening periodically by the roll of the dice, but it's coming. And so that's kind of when I'm talking to customers or potential customers who are trying to decide how they're going to reinvent everything, I think there's a temptation in some people's, use cases to say, oh, we're going to think about continuous delivery and cloud and all that stuff, maybe in Q4. It's okay, I mean, that's cool. You can wait to start, but everybody else already has. So those of you who are here and in this room and ready to bring your organizations into, whatever the next step is for you, you're in the right place. And this is why, in a lot of these organizations, this bimodal IT nonsense, some of you may be subject to. You're probably all in, it's awesome mode and sad mode, right? And most of you, if you're here, you're probably on Team Awesome. Maybe you're on Team Sad and you really wish you were on Team Awesome. And the frustrating thing when these companies are we're going to have some segments of the organization that don't have to change anything, and they can just keep doing everything exactly the way they were. Either, like, that just doesn't work, or the people who are stuck not being able to innovate, not being able to change anything, don't want to do that. And if they can't move on to Team Awesome, they're just going to leave. And so, like, this is it's an anti-pattern that I think some parts of our industry encourage. And, like, I would encourage everyone inside their organizations, if somebody is saying, this is going to be our innovation team, and it's like, really? I mean, I hope your whole company is going to innovate. It doesn't mean that some people aren't going to maintain things that already exist. I mean, I tried very hard not to use slides I used last year, because I know I was here last year. But I do have one with, like, you know, a picture of an old typewriter or whatever, and it's like, your legacy stuff is where your customers and your money live. Like, if it didn't matter, you would just turn it off, right? So I think that's that balancing that tension of moving at the speed your organization needs to, and letting different teams, you know, different business units innovate at the speed that they need to, without saying, you're the ones that are frozen in amber and can never change, is super important. Okay, so, like, there's kind of an open question there of then, like, what should we focus on? So, like, I'm telling you some things that you shouldn't do, but, like, what should we focus on? And I would say that there's a lot of places, especially because I know that there's a lot of operations people here, or people who are writing code for, you know, custom development, but it might be supporting the production operations. And I want to be realistic about the kind of stuff that is, frankly, kind of ridiculous trends in our industry right now. Like, for example, day one, everybody wants to paint a happy picture, including vendors. I work for one. We're not immune to this. Everybody wants to paint a happy picture of what day one looks like. You know, you develop your application, and you ship it to production, and everything is like one-click deployment, and it's perfect and easy. And it's like, yeah, I've got unfortunate news for you. Like, day one is really short, and day two is forever. And, like, whatever it is that you did that one time, you also want to be able to do it repeatably. Because, like, you know, some sort of vulnerability comes along. It seems like we have lots and lots of excitingly named vulnerabilities these days. As soon as that vulnerability comes along, you want to be able to push new changes out. And if you ended up with a really artisanal, bespoke, hand-whittled process where you couldn't deploy new changes, you've got problems. So I guess, like, that's kind of, you know, that was a Tack Kitten, like, over a year ago, and he's more this size now. And I'd say, like, I did not pose him like that. He did that, and I was like, where's my phone? But that's kind of the reality check, is when people say, oh, we'll just go serverless, it'll be great. And you're like, you realize there's still servers, right? Like, you just can't SSH into them, but they exist. They still have to be patched by someone, hopefully whichever partner that you're working with. And this is kind of I don't know, I think as soon as people start saying, like, oh, we just have no ops, or we have balanced teams, and it's like, okay, and that's cool. It's good that your teams are going to be balanced, but everyone is not going to literally work on every single thing at the same time, because that's not reality. So watch out for that. Okay, let's see, what else should we talk about? Oh, yeah, so on the topic of tools, they are really important. I think there was a time, there's a pendulum in the DevOps community where people are like, everything is culture, hug ops, and then people are like, let's have a talk about containers or whatever. And the reality is, you obviously need tools. Like, we're not gonna just, you know, go camping with no electricity and be like, we're DevOpsing so hard right now. Like, that's not gonna happen. You obviously need tools, but we also need to make sure that the tools aren't what's dictating our choices. Because that's something that can happen a lot, especially if somebody gets really invested in a choice that they made, and then they kind of, you know, like, they kind of backfill, like, all their other decisions from, how do I make sure that everything else that everyone wants to do leads back to what the solution I already picked? It's like, all right, I mean, we can do that, but that's kind of I don't know, as the fractal complexity of our distributed systems grow, the tool choices become more and more important, because otherwise you end up with an unmaintainable mess, because a lot of enterprises, like, have everything, literally everything, and have to probably maintain it in production forever. So I've used this slide many times, just like the classic wall of confusion between development and operations, and the idea of development just like sending things over the wall to operations who have to maintain them and be sad. And I like to remix it as this because I think it's important to talk about how it's actually about incentives, right? So if your dev team is partying because they shipped, and meanwhile your ops team is like, you know, being paged and the site's melting down, like you haven't actually solved anything. You've just, again, you've moved problems around. So making sure that you're setting up the incentives so that everybody is on the same page in terms of what their goals are. And by that, I mean what they're rewarded for. Like that's what people are gonna pay attention to, right? So like if velocity of shipping is the only thing that the development teams are told to do, like they're not gonna prioritize everything in the backlog that's a bug fix because they've just been told, nope, we gotta ship. So like this is not a, you know, the dev teams are supervillains by throwing broken, you know, code over the wall at ops. It's more, and then you're like, oh, but we don't have separate teams for that. I'm like, well, you probably do have people inside all your teams who are the ones who are reacting most to stuff. So like look at how the incentives are set up such that what you're shipping to production is sustainable. All right, so some specifics like for people who have more of an operational bent, I think it's really important not to just like tell the people who are feature teams, oh, good luck, have fun, maybe here's some access to something, but not providing the support that makes it possible for that access to mean anything to them. Like, it's really important to have good automation so that you don't have the one-off thing where you have to go talk to Martha because she's the only one who knows how to do that deploy. Like, if you have something like that inside your org, fix that. You know, low-hanging fruit. You need automation around the things where a person's a single point of failure. You do need documentation, and I don't mean sit there and update everything in your wiki, because we know that's where documentation goes to die. But I do mean, like, when you write a commit message, don't just write, like, you know, stored the value. And you're like, that's great. 6 months later, you read that, and you're like, that jerk, oh, that was me. Because you know you can see what it does. You can read code. You don't know why. And so at that moment when you have the most context for the decisions that you're making, put that in, you know, your source repository with you, where your configs are, I hope, in the same source repository as everything else, just so that like when developers are trying to troubleshoot, when they're on call with you, they can actually see why you configured things the way you did. And then like being willing to share things between teams. And this, of course, is going to depend entirely on your business case. It's going to depend on how regulated your industry is, what sort of training different people have. So I'm not saying this is just to like give everybody the proud AWS creds and it'll be fine. No, probably fine. It's probably not fine. But like there is some necessary sharing and openness there that acting like ops gatekeepers does not solve. It doesn't make anything better. And you're like, okay, cool, this is a lot of stuff ops should do. Like, what should devs do? And I think it's really important to build for operability. And what I mean by that is you can actually see what the code is doing in production. Like there's tooling that supports you, but then you also are sending the correct information such that it's possible to answer questions about what is this actually doing? And debuggability so that you can solve problems, because I think I have seen code before where it's clear the developers thought about the happy path, which is great, and that kind of brings us to like my reality point is things are not always the happy path. Reality is things are almost never the happy path, and so thinking about corner cases is something that is not necessarily, thinking about operability in production is not necessarily what most feature teams are focused on immediately, because they want to at least get the feature, you know, prototyped and working. But before it's in production, somebody who understands what the code does should be thinking about operability in production. And this stuff is the hard stuff. Like, we talk about hard problems in computer science, and there's jokes about them being cache invalidation and naming things. And yes, and I've seen this joke remixed a number of ways, like for distributed systems and what have you. I mean, I would say like the main hard problem in computer science is we're interacting with other human beings. And they have undocumented APIs and variable responses and aren't necessarily going to do what we expect, which I don't know about you, but I find it frustrating. Like, I got into computers because I didn't want to talk to people. And as it turns out, that doesn't work at all. So I think, like, in 19th century France, they did a surprisingly good job of predicting today. This is a prediction from, about late 19th century, and they were imagining what the world of 2000 would be like. These are people trying to record a podcast over Google Hangouts. It's failing, obviously. The audio is cutting out. But it's kind of funny to think that the places where we run into frustrations today around our tooling, and that laughter told me that you've all run into this frustration. It's like we all work at organizations that have people who are sometimes or all the time far away, and we need to use technology to communicate with them. And that is one of the really frustrating things. But it's also one of the really important things. Like, we wouldn't do it if it didn't matter, right? And I think that trying to create systems that are not going to be frustrating for people to use. And it's so funny when you think about, like, especially if you work at an enterprise and you produce, user-facing systems, and then you use other enterprises' user-facing systems, and they fill you with the killing rage. And you're like, what do you mean it's down until 2 p.m.? I'm trying to pay my bill now. And, like, remembering that with all the systems that we create, that there are humans on the other end of them. And there are human end users, there are human, upstream consumers of whatever it is that we're producing, and remembering, like, what they need and letting it inform, what we're doing, I think is super important and underestimated in terms of, like, when we're doing, dev tooling and platform tooling and whatnot, we don't always think about the people who use it, and we should. So I would say, like, there are other barriers to progress that aren't just organizational dysfunction. They are barriers in our tools. And that wall of confusion I showed you before, it didn't look that bad, right? I mean, it was like this high, and they could probably, like, stand on their tippy toes and, lob the code over and not hit each other. But you're like, that's not what our architecture looks like. No, of course not. I mean, your architecture actually looks more like this, like all of ours does. And that means that we need to mindfully build and choose tooling that helps us understand the things that, those unknown unknowns that some jerk talked about, the stuff that we don't know to ask, because, like, that's the stuff that's gonna page us at 3 a.m., and none of us like that. So even if we add more people to the on-call rotation, like, what we really want is for we only to be alerted when it's, like, specifically relevant to us and actually actionable and necessary. So there's, I would say, like, the social debugging and cross-team collaboration stuff, which again does relate back to the interactions inside your org, is what you want to look at for something like this. I know Charity Majors from Honeycomb was speaking at Monitorama, where I just was, but there were also a lot of other, providers that have really good stuff. So look at things, look at tooling around your observability, I would say. And it helps you understand your environment. And just because you have good information about your environment doesn't mean that it's going to tell you what to do, or it's even going to tell you tell you something that you can act on. Like, my spouse Joe and I went hiking in Iceland for our 20th anniversary, and one of the glaciers had this sign that said, attention, natural hazard, calving an unstable glacier. Do not pass this point. And the guide took us right past that. I was like, this is questionable, but, like, even if I feel like every one of us has something in our architecture and something in our infrastructure that we know it's bad. We probably should have fixed it a long time ago. Maybe we can't fix it. Like, yeah, I got news for you. Iceland is melting, as well as everything else. So, like, it melted into my boots while we were hiking. Like, it's definitely melting. But the places where our architecture is unstable or, highly questionable, at least hang a sign on it. It's like, even if you can't fix it, just swallow your pride and make visible the stuff that you know is terabad. because that will make other people's on-calls less terrible. And I would say when you, just kind of a slight digression about monitoring is we did used to do a lot of our ops related stuff was very focused on our very static infrastructure. You know, we had our host checks and our disk checks, you know, and our load averages, very important. I still don't really understand why, because there's so many ways that can be misinterpreted. But we had a lot of things that we thought provided us visibility into what was going on, and it did to some extent, except that there were, as you know, there are many problems that aren't going to be caught by, you know, all of the dashboards and the checks that you already have. Because, I mean, probably right now you have a whole bunch of dashboards and checks for all the things that already went wrong, right? It's like, you know, somebody tries something stupid once and we have to take off our shoes forever. It's like those dashboards are, you know, probably should go away, but more importantly, it's valuable to think about what are you monitoring in your infrastructure that you probably need to be paying more attention to the interactions between the pieces. Like there's a, you probably, I don't know if you've read James Turnbull's Art of Monitoring. If you have not, that is a good book. You should definitely go check it out. But the reason I bring monitoring up specifically is because it's changed a lot since David Bowie sang about it, basically. Like you need to think about, because this relates specifically to dev and ops cooperation, right? If you have very static checks for things, you don't want to let anyone make changes. You don't really want ephemeral infrastructure. You don't really want developers doing God knows what, because you have everything in your, you know, legacy monitoring system. I won't name names, but you have everything in it set up exactly the way you like it. And if you're cringing and saying, I am the sort of ops person who would be terrified to let somebody else run amok in my, you know, carefully kludged together set of checks, like that right there is a smell. Like fix that, because you can open up more to other people if you embrace the fact that you're going to be in a state of continuous partial failure all the time anyway, and you just want, you will. I mean, that's just reality of today's complex systems. You're gonna be in a state of continuous partial failure. You want to know where the worst failures are so that you can deal with those. Because this is, like I said, I work for Andrew Clay Schaefer at Pivotal. It's been almost 2 years, and it's the first time I've ever worked at a vendor. I do regular evil checks. I'm not evil yet. But his whole, you know, like, come with me if you want to live. And I was like, I'll try that. It's worked out pretty well. But I like his perspective here where he's talking about we have a lot of focus on how we're going to get code to production, which is great. I mean, that matters a lot. But we also have to care about how stable production is and how well we can tell what's going on with it. So I would say, like, as you're talking to people and posing questions that you want to discuss in open space, think about that. Because it's like we can probably, everyone in this room, could get something out onto the internet that works for some values of works. The question is, can you get it to work to the values of works that you and your organization want it to? So that's pretty much my opinion, is that there's, if you've ever seen like Simon Wardley's Pioneers, Settlers, Town Planners thing, our world celebrates pioneers. Like, it just does. It says, you know, instantiated this novel idea that you've implemented in a slightly different way than other people. I mean, that's basically what people get really excited about, right? Innovation. It's like, that's cool. I mean, we definitely want that. But a lot of us in this room are probably really interested in day two. We're really interested in, now that we got something that works, let's actually scale it up. Let's productionize this. Being able to do that is how you go from having a cool idea, you know, cool user story, bro, to like an actual product. So that's, I would say, like, let's focus on being settlers or playing settlers. If we have, do we have board games tonight? We should totally play Settlers at Catan. Because that's it, right? I mean, you can't play a lot of, I like collaborative board games where you do need to cooperate with other people. And you can compete too, but you do need to cooperate to actually accomplish anything. It's just fun, it's more fun that way. So, yep, like I said, I'm Bridget Kromhout, I'm with Pivotal. We're big fans of helping you, create developer-ready infrastructure, and we have a conference in December. Come see me at the booth and Okay, take a picture of that if you like coupon codes. I'm told that's a coupon code for the conference. I haven't actually tried to register. All right, thanks.
Well done.
Thanks.
Some questions?
We're gonna take a couple of questions for Bridget.
We are? Okay, I ran all the way out of time, so I don't want to make us too late.
We have time.
We have time for a few
Gosh.
questions. So,
Okay.
anybody got questions on this side?
Any questions over here? Just raise your hands. And we'll come out to you.
I wasn't told there would be audience heckling. I should have planted some questions. Hey, Dave, ask me a question.
All right.
What would the drinking age be if Canada annexed Minnesota?
Ooh, I like that. What would the drinking age be if Canada annexed Minnesota? It was 18 or 19 in Minnesota for years, wasn't it? Before in the 70s. I think the 70s had the best music and also the best drinking age. So, yes.
So you're giving a talk and you're saying we should do it this way.
Yeah.
Who is it who you're trying to convince the most? Because a lot of people get it and they're struggling. They're bumping up against walls and they need help to like make a change. It's evil middle management. It's evil SLT. It's evil clients. It's Scrum Master.
Yeah.
Who is it and how do you break that wall?
Yeah, that's actually a really profound question, and it's difficult to answer without knowing the context of your specific organization. Sure, yeah, absolutely. So inside a lot of the organizations that I've seen, and I go in and I talk to a lot of customers, mostly at larger enterprises, and inside the organizations I've seen, there can be change agents throughout the organization who prod and say, let's try CI. Let's just, I have this Jenkins server I set up under my desk, but how about we try making this the thing all of us do? That can happen. I think you end up more successful when you can get somebody a little bit higher up in the organization who can say, why, yes, it is important to us that we pay attention to our MTTRs and that we incentivize people appropriately. And we don't just say, sorry, we just have to ship new features. We're not going to pay attention to that outage because that's somebody else's problem. The problem is if you just have adherence to we should change inside small pockets, but not higher up above their org chart, it's hard to align those incentives so that they're in line with each other to get the kind of improvements you need. So while it's not impossible to make small changes at the individual level, the higher you can convince somebody in the org to change incentives to make for the kind of behavior that's going to be more sustainable for everyone, the more success you're probably going to see in the short term at least.
My argument would be that it's requisite.
I'm not going to, yeah. And I'm going to repeat the comment that it's hard to change a whole organization without an executive sponsor. And I would say, in general, I think that's the most likely path to success. I have seen organizations where there was basically rebellion in the ranks. They got a grassroots DevOps initiative, and then later, for unrelated reasons, leadership changed. And then the new leadership that came in was very amenable to the stuff that was already happening inside the company. I have seen that in a major American retailer. So, that has happened, but it's not the most common path. So.
One more question if anybody's got one. All right, we're gonna wrap it up.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Bridget.
Bridget.
Well done as always.